Hello and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Center for Asian Studies of the French Institute of International Relations. My name is John Seaman. I'm a research fellow in the center, and I'm pleased to be your host and moderator for today's discussion, where we will compare approaches on economic security and as it pertains to electric vehicles and EV supply chains in both Japan and the European Union. In recent years, the economic interdependencies brought on by globalization, but also by distortionary industrial policies, particularly from China, as well as other countries, have become increasingly weaponized in a context of heightened geopolitical and strategic competition, particularly as it pertains to leadership in emerging technologies and the industries of the future. Economic security has emerged as a core strategic concept for creating greater resilience. We understand the need to de-risk supply chains that we consider to be critical through an effort of diversification. We also increasingly understand the need for a more robust industrial policy to bolster industrial and economic competitiveness, which is something that was all but unthinkable in Europe in pre-COVID times. But the question then is really what industries are strategic, or which industries are critical enough to warrant more robust policy support from the state, and how far should these policies go in what sectors? And the automotive industry, which we'll talk about today, and the transition into electric vehicles, in many ways sits within a gray area. It's not a strategic industry that touches on questions of national sovereignty or defense and security, and yet both Europe and Japan perceive the auto industry as a core industry for their industrial fabric. Indeed, it helps constitute a core of each country's or each economy's industrial ecosystem. It represents millions of jobs, and as such, helps to hold together both the economic and social stability in our respective societies. But as we press forward with the EV transition, in an effort to combat climate change, competitiveness and affordability are increasingly in tension, particularly as we're confronted with competition, as well as more coercive measures in recent years from China. And so to talk about these tensions facing the EV transition and EV supply chains in both Japan and the European Union, and how this transition is playing out, and how each actor, Japan and the European Union, are imagining and adapting economic security policies in relation to supply risks in EV value chains. I'm pleased to welcome three guests. First is Aya Adeichi. Aya is an associate fellow in the Center for Geopolitics, Geoeconomics, and Technology at the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin, which is a longtime partner of IFRI. Aya has also just returned last night, if I'm correct, from a visiting fellowship at Keio University in Japan, and is therefore very well placed to speak to us today about Japanese debates and policies. And she indeed has studied de-risking and economic security from a Japanese perspective, as well as how it pertains to the European Union. But also, she is an expert in Chinese policies, in Chinese foreign and economic policy, which includes economic statecraft and coercion, as well as in industrial and technology policy in China. And she was previously a researcher at the Mercator Institute for China Studies, which is another partner of IFRI, looking at these questions for MERICS, also based in Berlin. Then to discuss perspectives and policies in the European Union, I'm pleased to welcome my esteemed colleague, Marie Carpata. Marie is a research fellow in the Study Committee on Franco-German Relations, or CERFA, at IFRI. And in addition to studying German policy and Franco-German relations, she has spent many years delving into European industrial policy landscapes and the automotive industry and the automotive sector in particular. So she is very well placed to help us work through these issues today. And last but not least, I'm thankful that Henry Sanderson could also join us here today. Henry is a journalist and author based in London and currently an associate fellow at RUSI, a UK-based think tank, and a visiting fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Henry previously worked for 7 years as a journalist for the Financial Times, covering minerals and commodities. And before that, also lived for 7 years as a journalist in China, reporting in particular for Bloomberg. But most notably, in 2002, he authored a fantastic book that goes right to the heart of our discussion today, entitled Volt Rush, The Winners and Losers in the Race to Go Green, which I would encourage you all to read if you haven't done so already. So without further ado, I'll turn to you, Aya, to give us your analysis, first of all, of the challenges and the vulnerabilities that Japan perceives today with regard to the automotive sector, the transition to EVs, and associated supply chain risks, and then perhaps some of the key elements of Japan's response to address these challenges. So, Aya, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I will talk about the upstream challenge of critical minerals and rare earth processing, but also about the downstream challenge of Chinese EV production scale and the global pricing pressure. But I'll focus first on the mineral side. As John mentioned, in early January, China put 20 Japanese 40 Japanese companies on a list of export control on China's export control entity list. And out of these 40 companies, 14 companies have links to the auto industry, two OEMs, Subaru Corporation, but also Hino Motors, and others are first tier and second tier suppliers, indirectly affecting the automotive industry in Japan. And in a way that is uh, uh, yeah, heavily influencing the Japanese smooth supply chains but it's also Japan's also very well prepared since the 2010 incident where Japan was hit by um, uh, export restrictions on rare earth. Since then, very early on, most OEMs, but also suppliers, started recycling projects. Before the export restrictions hit Japan, Toyota actually launched a hybrid battery recycling network in 2009, but also other players such as Hitachi developed a rare earth recycling project in 2010. And then also Honda and Mitsubishi and Nissan each launched their own mass production rare earth recovery projects and all sorts of projects that led to Japan being a pioneer and a leader in rare earth recycling projects. But in other ways, Japanese companies also found ways to innovate the battery production to reduce the amount of rare earth being used in the production. A major milestone actually would be if Toyota successfully brings the solid state battery on the market, because overall that could significantly reduce the overall mineral intensity and would also use lithium ion significantly less. Um, but other areas have also been a focus to reduce the amount of rare earth, such as re reduced rare earth magnets by Toyota to eliminate terbium and dysprosium and also cut neodymium by 50%. Another way to reduce rare earth is material substitution to replace neodymium with other materials. Honda has also created heavy rare earth free magnets and rare earth free motors. And there's also an elimination strategy by Nissan, removing rare earth from new EV motors. Um, and there are also other projects. But I guess the stories we hear more about is the famous JOGMEC, the government-backed global diversification enabler, um, and they allow for long-term financing for these projects because rare earth processing and mining is not a profitable business. So when I talk to Japanese stakeholders, a few mentioned that yes, the costs of not doing anything are high, but it's still also a challenge to get companies to to commit to these projects because they're not profitable. But nevertheless, there are some notable projects. The famous one is the Linus rare earth in Australia. There's also a very slow project, but still ongoing, a project in Namibia. There's the recycling project with France, also financed by JOGMEC, um, and a new potential project with the United Emirates with on battery anode supply chain. Um, I guess that's on I guess on the government-backed dogmatic diversification, but there's also the deep sea rare earth exploration. And just a few weeks ago, there was a milestone achieved in, I think, late February, where a rare earth was retrieved from 6,000 meters depth in the ocean near Minami Torishima. And it's a high depth, high concentration deposits that are under development. And in some ways, it's less environmentally hurtful because it's it's expected to create less lower radioactivity material than many land-based ones. And it also creates less, potentially less waste-intensive extraction methods. But there is obviously a fear, both in Japan and Europe, that deep sea mining carries significant mining risks on the the marine ecosystem, and it's widely criticized. But Japan is very advanced in exploring this method of um, uh, um, uh, uh, of mining or I guess of rare earth extraction. Um, I guess I'm running out of time, but just to kind of sketch the other challenge is that China is overtaking Japan as a global auto leader last year. Um, with 27 million vehicles, China is now has now a 30% share of the global automotive industry, and Japan's share has downsized to 28%. And China's EV or China's growth is largely driven by EV. Um, and Japan is making significant losses in ASEAN and emerging markets. And it has a protected um, market in the US. I guess European automakers also have that in common. And Japanese uh, automotive companies have a very small share in the Chinese market, less than 1%. And it's a structural challenge that Japan has focused mostly on hybrid and less on BEVs. I talked to some automotive industry representatives that who said that they were very blindsided about the development in China, and they mainly focus on the regulation and market trends in the US, and didn't see that coming. So when the US um, did not uh, follow those goals in the 90s and early 2000s, they also explored more the hybrid route than the fully electric route. Um, and um, I think there are 2 points that I want to make here at the end is that there's one potential technology inflection um, where Toyota I guess Toyota is the exception. I should also mention that Toyota remains resilient still, whereas other Japanese car companies are making losses. Um, but if Toyota actually achieves to bring the solid state to the market and scales it, then it could potentially lead to Japan still being somewhat competitive in the EV industry, because their aim is actual solid state, not semi-solid state, and they are fast. The aim is to make them fast charging, and long to them to have a long range, and the durability of the battery could also reposition Toyota at the premium end of the EV. And the other potential uh, wild card is if Xi and Trump meet, or when they meet, I guess in March and end of March, a US EV, US China EV deal could alter the competitive dynamics for Japanese and European auto industry, but it's very uncertain and very difficult to predict. But I do hear that these conversations are being held in the US. So that kind of time that Toyota or other Japanese car companies have still in the US shielded market might be quite short. And in that time, I don't think that Toyota could commercialize a solid state battery. So that might mean that Japanese car companies would lose to competition with China and US. But this is very much a wild card and very difficult to predict. But I'll leave it here for now.
Great. Thank you, Aya. Maybe before I pass on to Marie, let me just stick with Japan for a moment, because I mean you talked a lot in the beginning about Japanese companies and the efforts that they're making on the technology side, particularly with regards to the raw material vulnerabilities. Um, and this is a conversation that the Japanese industries have been having, I guess, since 2010, really, as you mentioned, when China first started restricting exports of rare earths, particularly directly towards Japan. Um, but it seems that we're still far from a clear technological solution with regards to a rare earth free motor that is competitive, or rare earth free magnets, this sort of thing. It's something we've been talking about for 16 years now, but hasn't necessarily reached the degree of critical competitiveness. Um, at the same time, I feel that Japanese industries in some ways have lagged behind on the EV curve, more broadly speaking. I think this is maybe a theme we'll also hit on in Europe, but I'd be interested just to have a sense from you in terms of is has how have the Japanese industries really been investing in the EV transition? I mean, we don't see much of Japanese EVs on the roads. Um, Toyota is announcing something as you said, with the solid state battery for a full EV, maybe in 2027. But what explains in some ways this lack of movement, or this lack of, I mean, is why did, in some ways, Japan miss the EV curve? How did they misread, as you'd mentioned? How did they misread the market?
I asked those questions actually a representative of the automotive industry in Japan, and they said that they did explore that in the 90s and 2000s when the US wanted, or California wanted to bring to introduce regulations um, in a Clean Air Act, and so on. And they primarily focused on the US and didn't really follow developments in China. And when the US didn't follow through with these regulations, and they introduced car lanes, what do you call those?
Carpool lanes, yeah.
Carpool lanes. Instead,
Mm,
they went to the hybrid route because they were not confident um, to that they could achieve in bringing like introducing a car with
mm.
a long range and all these high criterias that they set um, uh, a high bar for. Um, so they completely focused on the US and were very blindsided by the developments in the past few years because they didn't see that coming from China. Um, but they did start the research on these. I mean, Japan introduced the lithium ion battery. So they did explore those options early on, but they couldn't see a way that they could commercialize it. Others um, um, uh, um, worked that option further and it ended up in Chinese hands.
Mm.
So I do I also kind of do sense that there is some regret, but I also um, and also uh, still kind of have this impression that Japanese companies and um, the government are very much focused more primarily on the US and the
Mm.
economic developments there than on China. It's still the larger
Mm.
market for them. Yeah.
It's an interesting dynamic, and I'm wondering in some ways, Marie. if that mirrors reflections here in Europe. So maybe, Mary, I'll turn to you to get a perspective of how Europeans view the challenges of the EV transition and supply chains in particular. What are the main questions that we're asking ourselves here? Obviously, we've been trying to set targets to push forward with the EV transition, but there's been some questioning of those targets, particularly in terms of the ability of our OEMs to be competitive in this space. So maybe you can give us a lay of the land of how things look here in Europe, and then welcome, Henry. It's good to see you. We'll turn to you after this for your thoughts and for some discussions on the China angle of all of this. But Marie, why don't you give us a perspective of how things look here in Europe?
Mhm. Thank you, John. So 5 points I want to make. First point, I think, is just the strength of the sector. Three figures. The trade surplus in cars in Europe is 93 billion euros. So it's the main traded good in the European Union. Second figure, it's 2 million jobs, manufacturing jobs in Europe, and it's 11 million passenger cars that were produced 2024, which is 15% of the world market share. And obviously, this is a sector that also triggers a lot of research and development, and also fiscal revenue, and has also synergies on different other sectors, like the new technologies in information and communication, chemical industry, textile industry, steel industry, and so on and so forth. Now, the second point I want to make is that it's also facing difficulties. Of course, we are evolving in a geo-economic landscape that is very difficult for European car makers. The biggest export markets of the European car makers beside Europe are the US and China. So the US with 21% of European cars being exported there, and China with 10% of cars being exported there. And the US, with Donald Trump's tariff policy, represent a challenge to the European Union car makers, but also the fact that he's dismantling Joe Biden's climate policies, which has consequences on the electric vehicle sector. And when you look at China, well, the market share of European car manufacturers in China is decreasing, and also China is increasingly representing a fierce competition for European car makers also in third markets. Now, coming back to the US, so the tariff policy of Donald Trump, it's 25% of sectoral tariffs, and this has consequences on European manufacturers, some of them which are not on the US market, like, for instance, Audi, which are present in the European Union, which are present in Mexico, now rethink their strategies because Audi, for instance, has estimated that the costs of the tariffs last year for them were 1.3 billion euros. So they are reconsidering their choices and perhaps settling on the US market, and other companies like BMW and Mercedes are considering reinforcing their presence in the United States. Now, there are groups like Stellantis, which include Peugeot, Citroën, Fiat, and Opel, for instance, that are reviewing their electric vehicle strategies because Donald Trump has been dismantling some of the climate policies of Joe Biden. For instance, Joe Biden had the ambition that by 2050, 50% of the cars sold in the United States would be electric vehicles. That was scrapped. Also, purchase incentives of electric vehicles were scrapped, and also the fact that there were fines for manufacturers that didn't reduce CO2 emissions, that was also scrapped. So this creates a U-turn and a shift of some of the electric manufacturers that are on the US market. The third point, about China, what I wanted to say is that the market share of European car makers is decreasing. So You have, for instance, the German car makers whose market share collapsed by 33% from 2022 to 2025. You have also a telling figure that is that of Volkswagen, which at its peak in 2020 sold 42% of its cars in China and now is at 30%. So increasingly, the market share is decreasing. And also China is now also exporting its cars very much. As Aya already said, China is the main exporter of cars and overtook Japan. Also, you can see that they are present on third markets, which reduces the market share of European car manufacturers in these markets, but also increasingly as the US market closes down to Chinese exports, increasingly these exports come to the European market. So the European Commission launched a subsidy, it launched an investigation on subsidies from China to electric vehicle manufacturers, to Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers, and the consequences that has on the exports and on the European manufacturers in Europe, and consequently countervailing duties of up to 35% were put into place against electric vehicle manufacturers from China, according to the degree of cooperation of these actors. And there were countries within the European Union that were unhappy with these countervailing duties. So this investigation was launched under the impulsion of Emmanuel Macron, the French president, but there are countries like Germany that very much feared that the countervailing duties would also have negative consequences on their own industry, because they are very much exposed to the Chinese industry. And also they were fearing that they could themselves be hit by these tariffs because they have joint venture agreements with Chinese car manufacturers and electric vehicle car manufacturers. Now, the third point I wanted to make is that there is a slow path toward the electric vehicle in Europe. So there is a slow phasing out of the internal combustion engine, because there are on the one hand climate ambitions and on the other hand industrial realities. There's the Green Deal and the objective to become climate neutral by 2050, and the CO2 emissions from cars is 30%. So there is a need to act and to reduce these CO2 emissions. And there was this goal that by 2035 there should be a ban of the sales of new internal combustion engines within the European Union. But there was pressure from industrial players, for instance, Antonio Filosa from Stellantis, but also Ola Källenius from Mercedes. And so these objectives, these ambitions were eased in December last year. Then the fourth point I wanted to make is also showing that there are structural problems in Europe, also, and in the European car sector. Of course, there are, the market share in third markets is decreasing. There are cost problems, labor costs that are high, but also energy costs, which obviously are very high in Europe as well. Also, the industrial production goes down and hasn't reached the pre-COVID level, actually. Also, there's this slow phasing out of the internal combustion engine and moving toward the electric vehicles, which sends mixed signals to the customers, but also mixed signals to the manufacturers. So they do not have enough planning security to move to the electric vehicles. And then in addition to that, in addition to the slow adaptation to the electric vehicle, there is also other players that are more innovative and disruptive, for instance, on the software part and on the digital offer, for instance, Chinese competitors, but also Tesla, for instance. And then there's also another topic, which is vertical integration, which some Chinese players are doing very well, like BYD. So sourcing 60% of their components in-house, which is something that European car makers are not doing so well. So this vertical integration gives them the possibility to benefit from the depth of their market, and also for research and development, especially in battery technology and in capital-intense technology, that also helps to scale and reduce costs and to work on the most efficient technology and the most affordable as well. So these are weaknesses of European car makers, and there are lots of layoffs in this industry. So since 2019, 110,000 jobs were lost in the car industry in Germany. So this is obviously a cause of concern, and there's a fear of deindustrialization. Now coming to the last point, and the different initiatives that are taken in Europe, I think first of all we need to understand that there is a tendency and a trend toward regionalization. So car makers are increasingly present on the Chinese market and on the US market, which happens at the detriment of the European Union industrial base. So they do that in order to avoid supply chain risk. They do that to avoid tariffs and to avoid market access restrictions and export restrictions. We have a company like Volkswagen that decided to invest 2.3 billion euros on the Chinese market in 2024, which runs counter the narrative of de-risking in Germany, so diversifying away from China. And although we had the cases of Nexperia and also the rare earth restrictions, export restrictions from China, there is a tendency of car manufacturers going even more on the Chinese market. So there is a dichotomy between manufacturers' interests on the one hand and the interest of the industrial base on the other hand. Now, if you take the European economic security strategy and its three pillars, if you take the promote pillar, I would say that the initiatives launched within the European Union concern IPCI, so important projects of communitarian European interests, where you can see battery projects that were launched in line with the Critical Raw Materials Act, but there are also semiconductor projects that were launched in line with the CHIPS Act. If you take the second pillar of the economic security strategy, that is protect, then you'd see the idea of European preference that has been floated, but this causes a lot of controversy in the European Union. So there's a lot of fragmentation also of interests within the European Union, also around this concept. And then if you take the partner pillar of the economic security strategy, you have the fact that there are battery companies, for instance, that are settling in Europe, especially essentially Asian battery players and actors. And there's, for instance, the question of BYD in Hungary, which again then raises the question of the circumvention of countervailing duties against BYD through the settling on the European market and on the internal market. And it also raises the question of the conditionality of such companies settling on the European market. So joint venture agreements and the question whether know-how could be transferred to Europe, which Asian companies have, but also the question of European preference perhaps being one of the conditions of these joint venture agreements. And then there is another example of partnering, which you hinted to, John, already, which are the free trade agreements, which is a way to diversify for Europe. So free trade agreements, for instance, with the Mercosur countries, but also with India, which are perceived important assets for the European Union car industry. So I think I'll keep it there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Marie. I think that's sort of that gives us a good basis for a comparative study here, and maybe I'll ask you a bit later to delve in on where you think synergies might lie between Japan and the EU. Maybe where we might have some areas where we can at least coordinate, if not cooperate, on our various policies in these supply chains and in the EV sector. But also maybe where tensions lie, where we might diverge on certain approaches, and how to deal with that. But before I get there, let me bring Henry in. So thank you again, Henry, for joining us. I've been reading your Substack nearly religiously on looking at particular on China's role in not just EV supply chains, but looking into things like batteries and critical raw materials more generally. But it's interesting in this discussion so far to see, on one hand, the effects of the U.S., sort of how the U.S. has shaped the strategies of various industrial players, either in Japan or in the U.S., and how the shifts in U.S. policies have really thrown us for a loop. And meanwhile, the other source of tension is really with China and China's place within EV supply chains, its dominance, its ability to produce EV technologies at a much lower cost. And so in the introduction in the beginning, we sort of explored this idea of a tension between competitiveness and affordability as we're driving forward with climate change policies to deal with climate change, and EVs, of course, are a big part of that. But we have we sense from Marie's comments there that we have a degree of reticence in terms of just how fast and how far we want to push with the EV transition. The 2035 goal seems to have been pushed back a little bit, or at least we're not quite as convicted about or convinced about this 2035 goal. Part of that, I think, is because of concern about industrial competitiveness, and part of the China question. So maybe you can introduce for us a bit China's role in all of this, and where Chinese auto manufacturers lie in terms of the EV industry, how Chinese policies have pushed them forward, how China has leveraged its position in many ways, and then how you think this might evolve moving forward. So I'll give you a bit of time to lay that out, and then we'll continue the discussion.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much, John. Great to be here. So as everyone probably knows, China is dominant in clean energy technologies, and importantly, a lot of times from all the way from the mine to the midstream to the final product. And what we've seen really play out since 2020, when China introduced its export control law, is China's strategy really is to export higher value products, and the whole system is geared towards incentivizing exports of rare earth permanent magnets, not the rare earths, batteries, not the midstream products, and electric vehicles, ideally. And you see the whole system designed around that in terms of VAT rebates, so the fiscal system, the subsidies at home, etc. Now, there's a couple of complicated issues. So as that developed and was incentivized, the internal competition within China has been so fierce, with lots of local governments investing in these industries, which were deemed strategic industries, that the Chinese players are now sort of killing each other to the death, and many are not making money. You have a few companies that are making money, such as the big ones, CATL or BYD, but the whole supply chain, hundreds of companies across China are not making money, and prices have just been squeezed, margins have been squeezed. So essentially what's happened is those companies now, they need export markets more than ever. and they also need to rapidly innovate to stay on top of the market. And that's what you're seeing is a lot of innovation, a lot of new products, whether that's fast charging EVs or new battery products, consistent innovation, new products, and then also the focus on the export markets. And then that's where we get to one of the contradictions, which is China needs exports, it wants to export, but at the same time, since the export control law has been ramping up controls on exports of rare earths and other products, and critically the technology that China has a hold over, so processing technology, rare earth separation. So now it's extremely difficult to export any of that technology. But since it's faced trade pushback, the Chinese strategy has been to invest overseas and to get around tariffs and properly localize operations. So in Hungary, we've seen that, Brazil, we've seen that. And so the conflict really is how can you have a system of export controls on a lot of these minerals and technologies and also build a manufacturing supply chain outside of China in Hungary and Brazil and elsewhere? Are they going to get approvals to get these inputs into their manufacturing? Are they going to be able to get the technology out of China? It looks like they can. So China's export controls will be very selective. They'll give licenses to Chinese companies. But there is a conflict. I don't think Beijing wants to see its technology be built overseas in case foreigners get the technology and then manage to compete with China. So I think there is, in my mind, a fundamental conflict, which is the Chinese companies want to export and invest overseas and they need these other markets. But I think Beijing at the same time doesn't want to give away its technology. It doesn't want to give away its leverage over critical minerals. So I think for Europe, it's a really worrying situation because China, through its export controls, has almost complete, absolute control over rare earths and other things. And obviously, you have the dual use side, so they don't want it to be used for military. But it's a grey zone, right? They effectively can control and shut down a lot of these things. So Europe faces a choice. You either accept the Chinese investment, do joint ventures with Chinese companies, or you're going to have to build entire supply chains that don't rely on China all the way from mine to finished product in case China withholds any stage of that supply chain. And it's important to note in rare earths, you can't use China as a processing, you can't toll through China and then get the product back. No, once you send rare earths to China, they're staying there and they're coming out in a product. So I think it's a really worrying situation. And on top of that, people have mentioned what the US has done, which is cut subsidies for electric vehicles, which has been extremely damaging to building out a non-Chinese supply chain. So I think the situation as it stands is a really uncertain one. And even within China, as I said, the competition is so fierce that also a lot of these players may consolidate or may not survive. So that's how I see this sort of overall picture. That helps.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. That is very helpful. And one thing that you mentioned in terms of this tension between OEMs and Chinese companies and Beijing and state policies. We particularly with regards to the very thin profit margins, or in some ways, many of the companies you said that aren't making money, and need access to overseas markets, need to export. Part of that feeds back into a discussion. Again, I'm sort of referring to some of your Substack pieces before, but there's this question about China's ability to innovate, and you need that revenue from exports. They need the revenue from foreign markets, whether it be the Japanese market or the European market or Southeast Asia, where they're competing with Japanese and European firms. So they need these markets in order to generate revenue to feed back into innovation. And one point that Aya, you raised was about this question of Toyota's drive in particular for solid state batteries. So maybe both Henry and Aya, just one question to bring up here is about the state of technology and the ability to innovate. I mean, is Beijing shooting Chinese companies in the foot in some ways with some of these policies? Are they limiting their revenue streams? Are they limiting their ability to make money and reinvest that money into innovation that can sort of stay ahead of the curve? And does that create a window, I guess, of opportunity for Japanese companies? I mean, Aya, you talked about Toyota and their solid state battery ambitions. Where are we in terms of the innovation curve? Are Chinese companies still able to innovate despite not making money and being able to reinvest that into innovation? Maybe I don't know which one of you wants to go first. So maybe Henry, you wanna
Just
pick that up, and then we'll go to Aya
I think you've hit a
on
really good point, which is that obviously if your margins are bad, you're making less profit, you've got less to plow into R&D, but we're not quite there yet. So at least we see the big Chinese companies, the CATL, BYD, huge R&D teams. I think CATL is like 4,000 R&D, so huge amount of R&D investment. In some ways, this involution or this excess competition, as I say, pushes innovation because you need to find some way to stand out if you can't necessarily compete on cost or you've tried that. So at the moment, we see huge innovation. My bet would be, well, we're already seeing solid state, coming in China, and probably by 2030, we'll be further ahead. I think it's extremely hard for foreign battery companies or companies outside China to compete with China on the innovation in batteries just because they have such big teams and such big R&D. But there is a broader question, which is if this kind of blind expansion and overcapacity continues and foreign markets push back and there's a downturn within China in terms of consumer demand for electric vehicles, yes, I think a lot of these companies could be in trouble. And we've seen in the solar sector massive losses, right? And consolidation and other issues. So I think, yes, that could lead to less R&D investment in innovation. But as it stands now, we're not there yet. And I think they're very far ahead in innovation and R&D. And the biggest way you learn about actually commercializing innovations is obviously having a big production scale. So I find it hard to see that other companies would compete. In fact, what we're seeing is because of Trump's policies, the Korean battery companies have had to pivot to energy storage. And so they're now working on catching up to China in a technology China's already, mastered. So they're actually always, behind in that sense. So I find it hard to see that we're going to see a big solid state breakthrough commercialized and scaled out outside China before China does.
That's relatively discouraging, but very interesting to note and good to note. We've had some investments here in France into solid state batteries, particularly with a Taiwanese company, Prologium, where we're trying to build out our Dunkirk industrial ecosystem with regards to batteries and EVs and this sort of thing. But you mentioned something really interesting, and so I'll come to you on this question, but then maybe broaden it out just a little bit as well for you, Aya and Marie, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. But Henry, you mentioned about pushback from China or on China in many ways, in whether or not we're going to see more protectionist measures, tariff barriers, these sort of things go into place here in Europe or in Japan or elsewhere. Obviously, in other markets, Southeast Asia or Latin America, we're seeing signs of that. The question, I guess, is then, what sort of protectionist measures can we accept, and is there a way to we don't want to call this protectionism in some ways. We want to create a rules-based market, level playing field. That's what the countervailing duties are all about. Basically saying, we've had an unlevel playing field for so long with China. Countervailing duties are to correct those distortions in the market that China has been able to put in place. But if we're only doing that Europeans, it doesn't make any sense. You need a broader community of countries to put in place some sort of common rules for market. We're getting that space in critical minerals with the US's Forge project or whatnot. But maybe Aya and Marie in particular I mean, is there room for coordination and cooperation, both in terms of how we respond to the China pressure, as Henry's been talking about, but maybe on some of the other challenges as well. And with regards to the US, I mean, we're clearly making our strategies and our policies relative to what the US is doing as well. So maybe some thoughts in terms of how US or the EU and Japan might be able to push forward in cooperation.
Yes, I didn't get the chance to say anything on Toyota's solid state
Yes,
battery.
you also do that. Maybe you want to start with that and then
Okay.
lead into my second question. Yeah.
So the solid state, the state of solid state in Japan is it's very unclear to me how advanced they are. The plan is to scale, commercialize, starts in 2027, and by 2029. You see increased patents in solid state activities, but there's also a major difference in how the Japanese and the Chinese approach solid state batteries, in that China has created a lower barrier for what they call a solid state battery. And at least from my understanding is that Toyota has a higher ambition. But at the same time, they have been exploring this for a long, long time. So I think for over a decade, they have kind of explored this avenue. So I'm not sure what the actual state is, but if they succeed, it could potentially be very beneficial. And the benefit of Toyota is that it is probably the company that could scale relatively fast. Not just with Toyota cars, but also with its subsidiary or the other car lines that also uses Toyota hybrid technology applications, such as Subaru, Mazda, and Suzuki, and I think Daihatsu. That I guess Toyota benefits from being able to could potentially benefit from scaling fast, and then that is one thing. But at the same time, Japan has this issue of perhaps kind of too many players relative to size of country. So Japan also has a problem in that the Japanese players also have to export a lot, and whereas European car companies have a little bit of a protected European market, Japan is a bit more vulnerable in that sense because the Japanese market is comparably quite small. And then there's kind of interesting parallel to China in that sense. But this kind of pressure to consolidate is so far not moving forward. There's a few years ago there was conversations on Honda and Mazda merging, but the management level seem not to agree on how to proceed. And it's quite difficult to move that conversation forward. But the market is changing, and in some regard, I think in Japan, there are conversations being held, and to my sense, a bit more boldly than in Europe on how to proceed. Moving on to the follow-up question, in that there are talks about how a protective market excluding China. And the Japanese are more, I guess, confident in having that conversations with European counterparts these days. And I think compared to a few years ago, the conversation in Europe is changing as well, with price floors on rare earths now being discussed, and also the Japanese came up, at least I've witnessed them proposing joint projects on permanent magnets with Europe, being under this condition of a protected market without a Chinese player. So I'm not sure how Europe is reacting to these conversations, but I think it's changing a little bit.
Yeah. It seems to be. Maybe Marie, you have some insights into how Europe is reacting to these initiatives and these discussions. And maybe before you respond, I'll tack on an additional question, one in the room here. So those in the audience, please don't hesitate to raise your questions. But one piece of the European response is the Industrial Accelerator Act. So our colleague Marc Julien has asked a question about that in terms of how consensual this movement for an Industrial Accelerator Act on the part of the Commission is within Europe. And within that act, some of the discussion is also about what you had mentioned before in terms of European preference. That seems to me to be a natural source of tension between countries that would need, as you said, need export markets. I mean, Japan has to export its vehicles in order for its auto industry to survive. And if Europe is putting up potential barriers to that, obviously that will complicate things. So Marie, maybe you can talk a bit about how you see potential for overlap with Japan and maybe some of these sources of tension, one of which I've just sort of put on the table for you. But how do you see things?
Yeah, so I think there is this question of sense of urgency within the European Union. So we have Ursula von der Leyen, which in Davos talked about the sense of urgency, for instance. So the president of the European Commission has been quite firm in her rhetoric, as was the case of Emmanuel Macron as well, the French president. But we see in Germany that things are a bit more complicated because, as you mentioned, John, it is also much more exposed to the Chinese market. So Friedrich Merz just went to China and met with Xi Jinping, where he addressed the question of overcapacities, Chinese overcapacities. He addressed also the trade deficit. So the trade deficit of Germany toward China is 87 billion, which is 20 billion more than the previous year. So that is increasingly being felt as a concern in Germany. China being the main trade partner of Germany, so from 2016 to 2023. But again, last year, China was again the main trade partner of Germany. And in terms of exports, the exports from Germany to China go down by 9% last year. So this is increasingly something that is felt as a concern. Friedrich Merz also mentioned the currency depreciation as being a challenge to the competitiveness of the European industrial base. But in Germany, you traditionally have a clear separation between the business community on the one hand and the politics on the other hand. So there is no interference between these two. And I think one major shift was the war in Ukraine and the fact that Germany had to decouple from Russia, and now increasingly there is this anticipation of what this would mean with a player like China, where the relations are much deeper. And Germany is a big player, of course, within the European Union, and the whole economic security agenda cannot be thought without a player like Germany, which is, of course, the most important economy within the European Union. So I think there is there's cooperation possibility on aspects we already mentioned. So I think Europe would have a lot to learn, because I think Japan has a higher maturity than Europe when it comes to economic security. And as Aya mentioned, there was already the case of 2010 and the case of rare earth restrictions. And it had to adapt. Japan had to adapt to this situation. And in Europe, there is currently the beginning, starting of an acknowledgement of this term of economic security, actually with this economic security strategy that was launched in 2023. But in Germany, you also have the national security strategy and the China strategy that were launched in 2023. So all of this pertains to a de-risking strategy with politicians and think tanks and industrial players that are supposed now to dialogue together, and a China commission that was set up also in Germany very recently. But of course, you have these divergent points of view with those who are more hawkish, and Friedrich Merz seemed to be more hawkish with a couple of speeches he had on China, where he said that this was a problem. But then Katharina Reiche, so the Ministry of Economy, which doesn't seem to be very sensitive to this question of economic security. Now, in terms of cooperation, I think the question of critical raw materials and critical raw material partnerships with Japan could be something interesting. Also, the mere identification of choke points and of screening possibilities is also something that is important to recognize the dependencies and try to anticipate them, which presupposes also a high level of confidence of the companies, which is of course very tricky. But I think Europe also has to learn from other players how to deal with coercion practices, and the automotive sector is one that has been facing coercion. A couple of years ago, the Chinese ambassador to Berlin said that the German car industry would face negative consequences if Huawei was excluded from the attribution of 5G networks, for instance. But now there's also the question of the export licenses for rare earth, where we give European companies give visibility on their supply chain. So how do we react to that? How do we anticipate that? How can we manage these questions? So I think that there are best practices to be shared. There's in Germany also a fund on critical raw materials that was set up. So there are initiatives, but everything is very slow. And you also pointed to the fact that there is no business case to be made. So it's not profitable for companies to work on extracting or processing these critical raw materials. So there needs to be an understanding that this is not about economic efficiency, but this is about security. And this needs to sink in. And I would say that another interesting thing is in the automotive package in Europe that was issued last year, in December last year, there's this small affordable car initiative where Europe seems to look in the direction of Japan as well, and similar initiatives that were taken with small cars, electric vehicles being with credits also for car makers in this field, but also with fiscal advantages and with non-fiscal advantages, like using priority lanes, but also the fact to not have to pay tolls for roads, having better access to parking lots and things like that. Also having exemptions when paying for the charging of these vehicles. So this seems to be an initiative where Europe has been looking at Japan as well. Regarding the question you point out with protectionism and this question of European preference, which is indeed included in this Industrial Accelerator Act, of the European Union. This triggers a lot of controversy. This is something that Emmanuel Macron was pushing forward very well. And this is also part of the deal that was sealed last year on the 2035 package. So the Germans could push for their interests with this objective being eased with e-fuels and biofuels that now are part of this deal. So the internal combustion engines can continue to be sold at the condition that biofuels and e-fuels are used. And the French counterparts, so the French interests in the deal that was found was that green steel would be part of the components used in the electric vehicles. Now, there is a lot of opposition from the industrial field because green steel made in Europe is, of course, much more expensive than than the steel that they have been supplied with so far. So there's really the question to give credit to the companies using green steel made of Europe. But there was this famous interview of Emmanuel Macron 3 weeks ago in Le Monde, where he mentioned European preference, and this triggered a lot of reaction from the Baltic countries, from the Scandinavian countries, also from Germany, saying that this is not part of the welfare model of the European Union. That is not what Europe's wealth was built on. Such measures that are considered protectionist measures, as the European Union model is a model that is very much dependent on is very much dependent on trade, on international trade, and if you favor EU preference, then you potentially exclude also cooperations with other partners and also like-minded partners, which is actually them you are targeting at when diversifying away from China. So this triggered a lot of reaction.
Great, thank you. Well, it seems to be a lot of potential for cooperation in terms of ideas for inspiring different policies, as you said. I particularly note this small affordable car initiative. I thought that's quite interesting. But even then, it seems that the Europeans we ourselves are not necessarily in agreement in how to move forward on this. Henry, I don't know if you want to jump in here and add your thoughts or comments to this cooperation piece. I mean, so I guess you're sort of the one who prompted my thought about pushback to China. But do you see how here in Europe? I mean, are we? What is your impression about what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, and maybe how we might be able to work with Japan better in this field? If you have anything to say on that, I'd certainly be happy to hear your thoughts, but I don't want to push you on that. We've got some other questions here.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, I mean, it is interesting. Stellantis is now using Chinese tech from Leap Motor. So that's a sort of interesting example of reverse tech transfer. So I think that's one route to get to more affordable EVs. But again, in the rare earth space, in the sort of processing or midstream space, it seems unlikely that we could get technology from China given the controls put in place. So I think that there are going to be limits, but yeah, I don't have any strong thoughts. So happy to.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing on the technology piece, and at least on the upstream that you mentioned. So we also have a question here in the chat about some strategic projects, and we've got this initiative here in Europe on strategic projects. There was recently a report also from the European Court of Auditors, essentially to talk about how the European Critical Raw Materials Act has fallen far short of expectations. One of the big pieces of that was to identify strategic projects that we can build out here in Europe. And the analysis seems to be that that's not moving far enough. It's not moving fast enough. Is there is from the private sector perspective? I don't know if any of you have necessarily something to say too much about this, but this is really the question in particular, which is looking at one project here in France for lithium mining and processing called the Emily project. There are lots of other strategic projects on the books, 47 within the EU and 13, if my memory is correct, outside of the EU. But to what extent does that really meet corporate expectations? Does that are investors actually interested in getting involved in these things? We do have some successful cases, particularly on Japan, with Japanese investments in France into the CareMag facility to do rare earth processing, to recycle rare earth magnets. We have some cases where Japan gets involved, both with public money and with private money. Do we see this as some fruitful area of cooperation, or I mean, are the critiques from the Court of Auditors, is that are those correct in saying this is just not nearly enough, and we're not doing enough to pull in the capital needed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit soon. I mean, soon to say it's been a failure because mining projects take a long time, right? We're talking a massively long time, 10 plus years to get a mining project going. So these things take a lot of time. I mean, could there be more money? Yes. I mean, the more money you throw at the problem, the more helpful it is. But I think in rare earths, you mentioned the Japan example, China again last month put further export controls on rare earths to Japan. So the incentive to build out an ex-China supply chain, especially in heavy rare earths, is only getting in stronger and stronger. And you're right, France, Solvay, and Carasta, there's projects with technology. So a critical question really is the incentives for the downstream. Who's actually going to pay more to support these supply chains, and how are you going to get them to pay more? And this is really the critical thing with policy. And that's why I liked Biden's policy, because it said that you can get 7,500 off the cost of an EV if you use, part of it was if you use minerals from US or free trade agreement countries. So essentially what that did was incentivize the downstream to switch to higher cost inputs, because they would get a consumer facing rebate. They would get some of that money back by having lower cost EVs. So that's so critical. That's why Trump's policy is not good and doesn't work, because where's the incentive to pay more to get a rare earth magnet made outside of China or something else made out of China? And that's really the issue. You're asking the downstream to pay more at a time when we've talked about they're facing even more competition from Chinese companies. It's just a kind of impossible ask. No one corporate puts their hand up and says, we want to pay more to achieve a geopolitical objective. Now, with the export controls, as I say, on rare earths, there is a business proof interest to diversify and build out a supply chain. So I think it's too early to write off. I think there are things Europe can do. There is issue with radioactive waste. That's one of the things with rare earths that's got to be sorted out. Permitting obviously is a huge issue. I mean, if you look at just mining, I mean, the projects mentioned here, I agree, is an interesting project, but mining is very, very difficult from a permitting point of view, from getting locals to agree, and that's the case in the US as well. So how do you actually get these projects to go forward is a huge issue. But final point, prices are rising now. So something like lithium, you mentioned this French project, prices are rising, supply is much tighter, and you've also got much more resource nationalism with Zimbabwe restricting some lithium, Chile obviously sort of quasi-nationalized its industry. So, there's an opportunity with prices rising for these projects and investor interest to come back into the sector.
A ray of hope in there. I like that response. I don't know if you have anything to say on the back of that, and also an additional question that's come into the chat. So when we talk about Japanese investor interest, we talked about this project here in France, but there's also a question in the chat here about Japan's subsidiaries in Southeast Asia. And you'd mentioned a lot of the tensions around access to third markets, particularly in competition from China. And if you have any thoughts on how to bring in, Japanese sort of global footprint. All of Japan's automotive industry obviously doesn't only produce in Japan, and Southeast Asia is a critical part of their supply chains and their production. So if you have any thoughts about how that sort of extra Japanese network fits in, and if there is perhaps even space there for cooperation with European OEMs in terms of those industrial ecosystems outside of Japan and outside of Europe, in particular in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, Japan has had a very strong footprint in Southeast Asia, but now is losing to Chinese competition in Southeast Asia. It's felt most significantly. Japan has been, I guess, the first and foremost important investor in Southeast Asia in the past decades, but China is stepping up. And in terms of sales, as I mentioned earlier, Southeast Asia is where Japanese cars lose against Chinese competition. And in terms of Europeans in Southeast Asia, I think their focus in Asia has been primarily China, and they have never really significantly had operations in Southeast Asia and have exported from China, I think, to Southeast Asian market perhaps. But because Southeast Asia is becoming difficult, there is a bit more of a shift. I always get Suzuki and Nissan mixed up, but one of them is a pioneer in India. And as India is kind of a market that is protective against Chinese cars, there is some interest, I guess European ones as well, but Honda is kind of betting on having a bit of a boost in India at the moment. They announced investments, and in some ways, I think Japanese companies in general have had a bit more of a longer history in India. So they're relatively familiar with navigating the difficult market there. But it's very difficult to find third markets to penetrate these days, and I think it's the priority for Japanese car manufacturers is still the US, as mentioned, then China, then perhaps some other markets. So improving sales in the first two still takes more priority. At least talking to some specialists in that field.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I can stick with you just for a minute, because Marc Julien has raised another question about Stellantis in the announcement from Stellantis to pivot back towards combustion engines, and that raises a question, one for you, Marie, in terms of the trend here in Europe. We touched a little bit about that. In terms of sort of this pushback from the 2035 target for EV transitions, but is there a similar tension? So before before I ask you, Marie, to sort of give the lay of the land in terms of some of the mixed signals that you said and where we actually see the EV transition going, and how convinced we are about this. Is there a similar tension in Japan in terms of how convinced policymakers are in terms of supporting the EV transition, or is this in some ways I don't yet have a sense for what the levels of policy support and conviction are in terms of the need to transition towards EVs? And is this more just an industry-driven initiative, or is this
the industry is there are still Japanese battery manufacturers, and they are still trying to support the sector. They receive support through the Economic Security Act, through the some of the companies are listed as receiving support for diversifying their supply chains. So that is an effort also to protect the batteries industry in Japan. With the industry itself, it's apparently very difficult for battery manufacturers to do more of the processing in Japan, although there might be interest in it. It's an area where Japan is also struggling with labor shortage, and I talked to some industry specialists who said that it would be very difficult to increase more of the value chain in Japan to be more independent. So the Japan is very kind of in a difficult position there, because they're trying to support multiple areas where competition with China is very high, like shipbuilding, for instance. They put shipbuilding also into the economic security, one of the sectors that they want to support, and save what they have. So the resources, I guess, are limited, and also in terms of if the companies are not interested in increasing the value chain in Japan, it's very difficult to push for that.
Okay. All right, thanks. We are running up on time. Two last questions came into the chat. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to those because we won't really have time for that. But maybe Marie and Henry, you can finish this off on your reflections in terms of this question about in order to ensure competitiveness, do we need to delay the rollout of the EV industry, or is this there seems to be a level of debate in Europe in particular, and some automotive OEMs, of course, have indicated that they're willing to push back and try to delay as much as possible that transition, which complements the U.S. approach. And we talked in the very beginning about how the U.S. is in some ways defining policies and positions of OEMs, and their approach to EVs has been delayed in some ways because of lack of indication from U.S. policies. And now we see that maybe Europe is also willing to delay or reconsider or rethink its deadlines. So maybe finish this off here then with just a perspective of where you see the EV industry going in Europe. Maybe, I don't know, Marie or Henry. Marie, maybe you want to go first, and then Henry, you finish.
Okay. Just a couple of words. So indeed, as Marc-Julien mentioned, Stellantis operated a U-turn. So under CEO Tavares, there was a clear path toward the electric vehicle, 100% electric vehicles for Europe, a path that I think 30% of electric vehicles for 2050 in the US. That was the Stellantis path before. Now with Antonio Filosa, we are going back to the internal combustion engine. Now, indeed, this is a sign of mixed signals I was touching upon before. But at the same time, when you look at how things are developing in Europe, there is a spot of light and of hope somewhere, because Volkswagen is actually doing quite well in Europe with electric vehicles, and especially also with the LFP batteries. So actually, for a long time, the problem of the electric vehicles was that they were too expensive. And now with the LFP, there seems to be apparently the same price as with ICEs for these small cars. And European OEMs have been waiting for this Small Affordable Act from the European Union to bring out models that are very small and that are affordable, and electric vehicles and made in Europe, and Volkswagen being one of them, but also Renault. So that would be a sign of hope for the European market. But then another thing I would like to mention is that if you take the German car industry, actually 78% of the cars produced in Germany are actually exported, and 2/3 of the production of German OEMs is done abroad and not on the German market. And so there was a lot of criticism also behind the trade agreements, EU-Mercosur and EU-India, that actually this could perpetuate the ICE, the internal combustion engine, further, because these countries do not have these objectives. So there's always going to be a two-tiered strategy, because the manufacturers do not only produce for the European industry. So just a few words from me.
Great, thank you. I just want to put a little point in there. Maybe Henry, you want to double down on this in terms of the LFP battery technology that you mentioned, which is a supply chain which is wholly dominated by China, and in their latest export controls, which have been delayed until November of this year, but of October of last year, the whole LFP supply chain for materials and technologies was put under export restrictions. Side point to that, but in terms of talking about affordability and trade-offs in terms of technology. But Henry, we're already 3 minutes past. Maybe you just want to give us some final thoughts in terms of where you see the EV industry going.
Yeah, I think Marie's right. There are more affordable vehicles. Cost is key. Right now, we're looking at a world where gas prices shot up this week, and I was just reading, £2,000 could be added to our bills in the UK. So cost and energy, I mean, obviously for the consumer, but also for anyone trying to build factories or plants is key. So I agree with Marie. There does seem to be some more affordable models coming through, which will help the market. I think obviously the Chinese automotives are becoming more competitive. I just saw a Chang'an vehicle on my street today, actually, an electric vehicle from. So I think that's going to continue as well. I do think as China sort of localizes the supply, to Marie's point on LFP, and there was a interesting question about North Africa, and we're seeing some projects in Morocco being built out, and that could be really interesting in terms of lowering the costs for European automakers or production within Europe. So I think, yes, it's all about cost. If you're not going to subsidize it, then it all becomes about cost. And I think that's really challenging if gas prices are going to go back up. So we have to see also how this conflict plays out.
All right. Great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you for bringing in the question in the chat that I wasn't able to post to you, Henry. But thanks to all three of you, Aya, Marie, Henry, and thanks to the audience for joining us and sticking with us. So join us again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.